feel free to converse in Māori should you so wish during the meeting. Warm welcome to everyone who's here and members of the community, local boards, good to have you here. Now we've got apologies from Councillor Anai, Councillor Filipaina, Member Ngamane, Councillor Quack Stewart and Member Taipiri. Anyone else we've heard from? If not, I'm happy to move those. Is there a seconder? Councillor Penrose. All those in favour please say aye.
Aye.
Against, carried. And Councillor Penrose, just while we settle in, good work on the dog amnesty. I think, how many are you up to? You've been out this morning with our dog control. 1,228. That is extraordinary.
900 still unknown.
You're a hero. Thank you.
Get them.
All those people who can be saved now from menacing dogs, well done you.
That's the team.
What's
the
that?
Management team.
Yeah.
Animal management team.
No, they're good. But good leadership. Declarations of interest? Nope, there are none. Confirmation of minutes. I'll move the 22nd of June.
Second.
With Councillor Darby, thank you. I'll put that. All those in favour please say aye. Against, carried. No petitions, no public input. We've got our local board members who are warmly welcome. Extraordinary business, no. Blah, blah. Nope. So I'll hand over to John in the first instance.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, councillors and local board members. So this is the last of our topic briefings before we receive the panel's recommendations on the 22nd of July. So that's under 3 weeks now. That was 3 weeks from last Friday. So we do have one more information briefing before the 22nd of July, and that will be on the process and some of the legal matters around receiving the panel's recommendations and the council's decision-making role. So, but this is the final topic session. So we have 3 topics in the report: transport, infrastructure, and natural hazards. So we're going to kick off with transport. I have Kevin Wong Toy here, who is our lead planner on transport, who was involved in the hearings before the panel and also mediation before the hearings took place. So as always, we're just going to start by a reference back to the regional policy statement. And Madam Chair, I'll probably just run through the whole presentation if that's okay and take questions at the end. It's fairly short. So in terms of the regional policy statement, there were four main themes in terms of transport. There they are on the screen. I won't read them out other than to just highlight integrating transport with land use is obviously a key part of the regional policy statement and the role that the unitary plan has to play in that regard. Movement of people, goods and services throughout Auckland and across to other regions, managing adverse effects and transport choice. So those are the main themes and they sort of flow right through into the rules of the unitary plan. Submitters' views in terms of the regional policy statement, obviously there was, as you'd expect, support for that integration of land use and transport. We don't want to be investing in transport where the land use isn't supporting it. We don't want to be allowing for certain types of land use and growth and so on without the transport being in place. So that came through as a strong theme. There were some submitters asking for greater recognition of different transport modes. So I guess that was some submitters feeling that the emphasis might have been on public transport rather than all modes of transport. So we heard that from some submitters. And other submitters wanting greater recognition of the adverse effects of transport, things like noise, air emissions and so on. So those were the key themes up at the regional policy statement. The approach that Council took into the hearing was really to retain the overall approach based on those 4 themes that I mentioned before. Some amendments to reinforce contribution transport makes to economic well-being came through, providing a bit more clarity on road-related noise mitigation if there are new roads going in place, particularly state highway extensions, major road widenings and so on. What should the approach be to mitigation? Should it be entirely on the landowners building in those areas in the future, or should also be some upfront mitigation when the roads are being built? References to port-related infrastructure. So we did have submissions from port company seeking that the transport section should mention the fact that the port is part of our overall transport system, and recognition of the hierarchy in the RMA of avoiding, remedying or mitigating adverse effects for high trip generating activities. So that's things like the supermarkets and so on. So there was greater recognition of not just avoiding adverse effects but also mitigation. So I suspect that one came from the retail sector. Moving on from the regional policy statement, one of the more innovative parts of the unitary plan has been, in my view, a shift away from always requiring a certain minimum number of car parks on site as part of a development. I think councils have heard for many years that some of those provisions are well out of date, and actually we're requiring far too many off-street car parks as part of a development. So with the unitary plan, there's a more balanced approach to requiring what we call minimums in some cases, but in other cases actually saying, well, there's a maximum number of car parks, because car parking itself can generate, or providing too much car parking can generate all sorts of congestion effects, and also, I guess, works against investment in public transport and trying to encourage more of a mode shift. So it's about getting the right balance. So when we talk about minimum parking controls, we're talking about you must, as part of this office development or retail development or residential development, provide X number of car parks. That's the minimum. And when we talk about maximum, that's us essentially saying through the unitary plan, you cannot provide any more than this number of car parks. So in the notified plan, we had a citywide approach for maximum and minimum parking rules rather than each of the former legacy council areas having their own approach. We had minimum parking rules that were generally lower than the rules from the previous councils. So that's where we are saying, through the unitary plan, you must provide X number of car parks, usually per square metre of development. Those minimums were generally lower across the board than the former councils, although in some cases the legacy councils had a similar approach. Those rules were designed to support that efficient use of land use, reduce development costs, more enabling for development. And another key reason for moving away from specifying large number of off-street parking minimums was really to encourage better urban design outcomes, so that development sites aren't dominated by either surface parking or parking within buildings. And of course, this all provides support for the public transport system. So it is a balanced approach. In the notified plan, it's not do away with minimums completely, but it's a move in that direction. Submitters, some of them were asking for us to go much further than that and actually remove parking requirements completely. No minimums, no maximums. You can just provide as much or as little parking as you like. Others sought that the minimum rates were reduced. So instead of having to provide, say, 10 car parks for development, 5 might be appropriate. In some cases, submitters were asking for those minimums to go back to the legacy district plan minimums, or even a higher rate, to ensure that there are no spillage of parking onto streets at all, that all parking must be self-contained off-site as part of the development. So that's those that were asking for us to increase the minimum parking rules. Also, just that second bullet point from submitters, include minimum parking rules for the centres, town centres, and the terraced housing and apartment building zone. So this is where I think we were pretty bold and innovative, in that in town centres across Auckland under the unitary plan, by and large, there is no requirement to provide off-street parking. That's correct. Under the proposed unitary plan. And in the terraced housing and apartment building zone, there is no requirement to provide off-street parking. You can provide it, but it's not required as a minimum. There are other zones where there is a minimum number of car parks required as part of the development. So we had submitters asking for minimums to be introduced into centres and the adjacent terrace and apartment building zone. We had submitters wanting to remove or amend maximum parking rates. So the maximums, that's the cap on the amount of parking you can provide within a development, generally apply in the city centre, as they have for many, many years here, and also in the metropolitan centres and some of the town centres. town centres all had a maximum rate. So no minimums in those centres, but there was a cap on how much parking you provide. We did have submissions, particularly from the big retailers and some office developers, saying that those maximums should be removed, or they should be allowed to provide more parking and not be capped. And lastly, remove or amend the city centre fringe parking overlay. So this is the area around Freeman's Bay, Ponsonby, Newton, I think Parnell, where there's quite a unique parking situation because you've got such significant employment in the CBD here that there are some quite unique parking issues in those areas. There's also the retail and entertainment, cafes, bars and restaurants in those areas. So there's quite a unique parking situation, and we had quite a customised approach to parking around the fringe of the city centre, worked through in quite a lot of detail before the plan was notified, and we had submitters asking for that to be removed or amended. And lastly, amend the city centre parking rules. So city centre has always had parking maximums, a cap on the amount of parking you can provide, and there were a small number of submitters asking for those maximums to be amended, typically increased. So that's parking. Maximums and minimums. Where Council landed at the hearings after mediation was essentially retaining the overall approach, applying maximum parking rules and no minimums in the larger centres and in the terraced housing and apartment building zone, and also in the mixed use zone. In terms of the residential zones, the parking rules that Council proposed at the hearings are there. So in the single house zone, a minimum of one car park would be required for every dwelling. In the mixed housing suburban zone, again, a minimum of one car park per dwelling, no maximums in either of those zones. When we move into the more intensive mixed housing urban, at 3 stories high, there was no minimum proposed or maximum for small studio or 1-bedroom units, but a minimum of one car park for 2 or more bedrooms, which will bring it into line with single house and mixed housing suburban. And then in the FAB zone, recognising that this is a zone that's only applied around centres with good public transport, no minimum was proposed, so that's basically the status quo, and a maximum of one car park for studio 1-bedroom dwellings, and a maximum of 2 spaces where there are 2 or more bedrooms. So introduction of a bit of a cap on the amount of parking you can provide as of right in the FAB zone. Now, one thing to keep in mind about these rules is there are provisions for applying for resource consent to infringe these controls. I think it's restricted discretionary. So it's not a hard and fast non-complying, no flexibility at all, but it would put you in a resource consent process if you want to provide less car parks or more car parks than on the screen there in terms of residential. City centre fringe parking overlay was proposed to be removed and instead rely on the parking maximums, which are no minimums in the fringe office area. City centre parking rules essentially retained, and parking minimums proposed to be reduced in the historic character areas. So that one car park per dwelling in the single house zone is the one that we're referring to there. There is some flexibility proposed by Council in historic character overlay areas to avoid forcing someone to provide off-street car parking that might compromise the character of a street of villas or bungalows, essentially. Moving on from, actually I'm just wondering, maybe it is worth taking some questions on parking, because this is quite a different topic.
Seen any hands go up? Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. I just wanted to, when we look at maximum parking, which I understand the concept, but we're having narrower roads in these areas, and people will still have more than one car quite often, and I already get complaints of lots of people parking half on the footpath, half on, the road, people can't get through, those sorts of things. So, and I know we can't put no parking signs everywhere. How is that, will there be rules about how we manage that kind of issue? Because at the moment we've got parking permits in some places, residential parking permits, because people who work don't want to pay for parking, so they'll, you know, park in St Mary's Bay or Ponsonby and walk down here, etc. How, I mean, that's my concern around this. We can have that, but will the rules define how we deal with that, or would it just be left open and then we'll just have lots of disputes?
I think when you
Out in
move,
public.
well, I think when you move towards a more compact city, if you look at cities overseas, it becomes less and less common that everyone has a car park or two car parks off street. So it's moving to a different approach where there is more reliance on how you manage your streets and how Auckland Transport manages parking on street. And so there's no doubt about it, as a city becomes more compact in certain parts, certain areas, you do need to be a lot more active in how you manage your streets and how you manage your parking on street. And that's just in line with other more compact, denser cities around the world in certain parts of Auckland. And we've already seen it happening. But yes, I mean, you can't, in the unitary plan, have specific requirements for the management of on-street parking, because that's Auckland Transport's role.